In all of human history, which single person has been the biggest waste of potential? Antoine Lavoisier, the man basically responsible for the conversion of alchemy into chemistry, an absolute genius who was executed during the French Revolution by a political enemy. The judge that sentenced him declared that the revolution didn't need scientists. In fairness, he worked for their version of the IRS, which, well, imagine if today, all your taxes were assessed by Martin Shkreli, collected by Blackwater mercenaries, and if you had any issues at all you had to do it through Comcast customer service. Would you possibly be inclined to guillotine some of the people responsible? Évariste Galois, a great mathematician who made astounding contributions to mathematics, only to die aged 21 in a duel. Had he only lived? He had a freaking rough life. Bad luck at every turn. Example, he failed his entrance exam to university, in part because his father committed suicide earlier that week. James A. Garfield came into office as one of the most qualified presidents in American history, having been a hero in the American Civil War and radical Republican congressman. He grew up very poor and his rise in prominence lends to his charisma and intelligence. In the time he was in office he purged federal corruption and advanced African American civil rights. Less than a year into his term he was assassinated by some corrupt goon, salty about his job applications being rejected by his administration. I would like to add to this that Garfield's doctors contributed to his death. After the assassination attempt his doctors began to operate on him using a metal detector prototype essentially. In order to find the bullet, the detector went off and they dug in, lacerated his liver, and he died. The bullet was nowhere near the liver. The doctors made the mistake of putting the president on a metal spring mattress. Charles Babbage. This mother spent his entire life working on designs for analog computers in the 1800s. He had the financial backers. He had interested parties that would have used his tech. And most importantly, he had working designs to build it. And he didn't build a goddamn thing. Why frick if I know. Guy couldn't stop trying to work on designs long enough to actually make anything a reality. We only know his designs work because the simpler of his designs, the one he needed to keep his backers and interested parties, was built in the 1990s and functioned flawlessly. It's not even a dinky crappy one-use computer either. The analytical engine design he made is Turing complete. It even had a programming language for it. And it even freaking could accept custom functions and modular expansions. This was a computer on par with something over 100 years ahead of its time. Even the earlier, shittier design had the ability to install a printer. The computing revolution by all rights should have started back with the Industrial Revolution. But thanks to this guy utterly freaking up and wasting all this potential, it didn't, and we are about 120 years behind schedule. I can say with complete confidence that the course of human history would have been completely, irrevocably altered had Babbage not fricked up and wasted his potential on absolutely nothing. He did build a small example prototype of his difference engine that he showed off at parties in the hope of attracting more financial backing. Part of the reason it was hard to build anything was because it was all handmade by cutters. I forget what the term is, but the people who would have cut mechanical gears. And the precision required was so high that it was a tough, long and expensive job. And Babbage was basically a bit of a man-child and rubbed people up the wrong way, which didn't help. There are some really interesting videos on the Computerphile YouTube channel where a university professor talks about Babbage, Lovelace and their work. Definitely not in all human history, but Ted Kaczynski, aka the Unabomber, always seemed to me a massive waste of human potential. A mathematics prodigy who earned his PhD by solving a problem so difficult maybe 10 or 12 people in the country understood or appreciated it. He gave up his career to go live in a cabin in the woods and make bombs which he'd mail to people. Currently incarcerated at Supermax Prison ADX Florence. What a total waste of potential. Holy heck, after just doing some quick searching, apparently he was experimented on, which might have led to him becoming the Unabomber. From late 1959 to early 1962, Murray was responsible for what would now be regarded as ethically indefensible experiments in which 22 undergraduates were used as research subjects. Among other purposes, Murray's experiments focused on measuring people's reactions under extreme stress. The unwitting undergraduates were submitted to what Murray himself called vehement, sweeping and personally abusive attacks. Assaults to their egos, cherished ideas and beliefs were the vehicle used to cause higher levels of stress and distress. Among them was 17-year-old Ted Kaczynski, who went on to become the Unabomber, a domestic terrorist targeting academics and technologists. Alston Chase's book Harvard and the Unabomber, The Education of an American Terrorist connects Kaczynski's abusive experiences under Murray to his later criminal career. Not a waste of potential but maybe a limiting of potential. I've often wondered what Stephen Hawking could have achieved without the burden of his illness. Or we might have had a Hawking who gave up physics in his 30s to pursue his dream of doing Parker professionally. My first thought is of Alexander the Great, because despite all he did, he died at a really young age without accomplishing much more. I don't think he's the biggest waste of potential ever. There's plenty of nameless people throughout history who qualify, I'm sure. I wonder what would have happened if Alexander had time to secure and consolidate his empire. Alexander wept when he heard Anaxarchus discourse about an infinite number of worlds, and when his friends inquired what ailed him, is it not worthy of tears? He said that, when the number of worlds is infinite, we have not yet become lords of a single one. Plutarch. Galois was an absolute genius, developed much of the foundation of abstract algebra, and proved that it is impossible to develop a formula for the roots of a polynomial of degree 5 or more. When he was 20 he was killed in a duel. In a similar vein, Abel, who lived during the same time frame and worked in many of the same fields, they both developed group theory independent of one another, died at 26 from tuberculosis. I often wonder how much more could have been accomplished had they not died so young. The thing that makes this really interesting sad is that he submitted a paper basically containing the core of the modern Galois theory when he was 17. It was rejected, and although he tried it with modified versions 2 more times they both got rejected as well. After that he was so frustrated that he spent his time with politics, got a bit radical, went to prison several times and then finally died in that duel you mentioned. A few years ago I had a 45-minute oral exam on Galois theory and it's some serious brainfuck just to try to understand it. I cannot imagine how much genius has to be involved to think up something like that when you are only 17. He would have done amazing things in mathematics if he lived longer. Edmond Albius, 1829 to 1880. He was a slave living in the French Bourbon colonies in the early 1800s and discovered the hand pollination technique for the vanilla bean plants in his early 20s, which before could only be cultivated in the Central Americas and had no efficient means of being cultivated elsewhere. As a child, his master sent him to work with a botanist on the island named Fariel-Belleau Beaumont, who taught Albius about horticulture. After discovering this technique, the vanilla industry exploded in France. Rose water soon became replaced by vanilla as an aromatic ingredient. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, who was a huge Francophile, brought vanilla to the United States when he learned about it. Unfortunately, being a black slave, Albius never received credit for his work, nor did he profit from it. He was emancipated in 1848 and died in poverty in 1880. Branwell Brontë. He was seen as the prodigy of his family and was expected to make a name for himself as a great artist and intellect. Instead he peeled away his potential with alcohol and drugs and accomplished next to nothing before his early death, while 3 of his sisters, Charlotte, Emily and Anne, went on to publish some of the greatest novels of the 19th century, before their early deaths as well. Robert Kennedy. He was on his way to being president, supported minorities and the poor, had a large amount of influence with his family name, and all of it was lost because of an assassination. JFK Jr. would be a strong contender for the list, too. Actually, really a bunch of Kennedys if they hadn't been killed or killed themselves. Évariste Galois discovered a new property of numbers and algebraic methods purely from intuition, as opposed to vigorous analytics. Died in a duel at a young age. Among men of a certain class, your honor and your reputation were paramount. You wouldn't be hired by someone if you were seen as having no honor. People did not seek your acquaintance or seek to associate with you if your reputation was poor. If someone besmirched your honor or denigrated your reputation, you were all but required to deal with it. Similarly, if someone challenged you to a duel over a slight against their honor reputation, you were all but obligated to accept for the same reasons. So yes, In one regard he could have not duelled, but then he would not have been received in polite, genteel company and would have found finding a patron difficult, finding meaningful employment all but impossible, and he likely would have been excluded from academics as well. Alan Turing, considered to be the father of modern computing. He was chemically castrated for being gay and subsequently killed himself at age 41. Don't know about all of humanity, but in India we have this guy called Rahul Gandhi. Despite the surname, he isn't related to the Gandhi who inspired MLK Jr. or Siv. What he is though, is a scion of the family of the first Prime Minister of India, Nehru, who was chosen to lead the country by Mahatma Gandhi himself. So Rahul's great-grandfather was the founding Prime Minister of India. His grandmother created Bangladesh and was assassinated in office. His father succeeded her and he got assassinated too. His mother Sonia was an Italian au pair. She wanted to keep her kids away from politics because her husband and mother-in-law were assassinated. She however got into politics and despite not knowing Hindi well and not being Indian, led her party to victory and ruled through a puppet for 10 years. Now though, she is dying of cancer, and her son is leading the party. He, despite coming from such an intense political background, is totally useless at it. Their political party has gone from ruling at the center in several states to not even being the primary opposition party and being ousted for power from even their safe areas. His speeches and interviews are the stuff of ridicule. He said stuff like poverty is a state of mind, politics is in my shirt and in my pants, and we need to attain the escape velocity of Jupiter. He did this entire pre-election interview where every answer was some combination of women empowerment and internal democracy, including ones about war and foreign policy. He got kicked out of several universities, including Cambridge and Harvard. He even failed an undergrad in India in his Hindi exams. Despite this, and his being 45, he is being heralded as a youth icon, because family, any other kid in that atmosphere would be totally killing it with all the power and access and would have learned a lot and played sick power games. Such a waste of potential. I'm glad though, because his family is the reason India is poor and corrupt and their ousting would be rather helpful in transforming India into a real democracy. Poverty is a state of mind. That's some Jaden Smith level stuff. Hitler and Osama bin Laden. Two men with the personal charisma to inspire millions to follow them and their ideas, and they wasted it on hate. Men who literally, proper use of the word, could have brought world peace and instead brought war, devastation, and death. Hedy Lamarr, completely self-taught, no formal training, yet invented spread spectrum technology, the reason we have Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and cell phones, with pianist George Gentile using knowledge she gained from her ex-husband. Had she not been born 100 years ago and subject to ridiculous ideas, still popular in some societies today, about the role of women, there's so much more that she could have accomplished. I don't think those men could have become the leaders they were if they proclaimed peace. Not to be a drag, but I think of all the women who were denied an education throughout history in favor of their proper place in the home and wonder what might have been accomplished. Also consider all of the people living in great poverty without access to education. There could be another Einstein living in a slum in some third world country right now and we would never know it. Thomas Midgley Jr. He was a highly successful, multiple award-winning chemical engineer who invented or helped invent two massively successful products that came to used around the world for decades. Unfortunately, those two products were tetraethyllead for leaded gasoline, and chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs. Each is amongst the most atmospherically destructive chemicals in human history, with TEL being additionally responsible for mind-blowing massive global neurotoxicity problems in humans, and lead pollution in the environment. This wasn't a guy who had potential and didn't use it, he met his full potential, in ways that have caused immense and nearly irreparable harm to humanity and Earth. And he died like a mad scientist being killed by his own invention. Awesome guy. The Zodiac Killer. This sucker had the brain to design cryptograms or ciphers that some of which remain unsolved, but used it to kill people and taunt the media. He really wasted his potential by becoming an Ashat senator for Texas. Jesus was a decent carpenter, but he left all that behind to pursue other career interests that ultimately led to his death. Heck of winemaker too, I hear. I'll cheat and say the entire Manchester United team of 1958, aka the Busby Babes, one of the greatest football, soccer, teams in history, crippled by a plane crash. Horrible tragedy. Athletes or musicians in places of the world that a sport or instrument isn't played. How many potential Wayne Gretzkys or Johnny Cashes have there been in other parts of the world where hockey and guitar music aren't parts of life? John Kennedy Toole. He wrote the greatest book ever, A Confederacy of Dunces, but killed himself after his favorite publisher rejected his book. His mom got it published and it won the Pulitzer Prize. He was only 31. Lenny Bias. He was drafted by the Celtics second overall in the 1986 NBA draft and died of a C overdose 2 days later while celebrating with friends. Many sports writers believed he had the potential to be a Michael Jordan-like player, but instead died before he even had a chance to play professionally. Most sports writers agree he would have been more like Clyde Drexler. Nevertheless, we were robbed of his great NBA career due to a tragic event. Not a waste of potential, we just lost it too soon, but Amy Winehouse. Holy heck, could that woman sing jazz like some of the greats. I'm really sad no one stepped in and got her out of the hole she was spiraling into. R.I.P. Yes, what a voice indeed. Speaks for itself how she got top chart spots in a decade where jazz was pretty much dead in that part of the business. O.J. Simpson. He had a steady broadcasting career, some acting success, and was still getting commercial endorsements. Alternate timeline. The Today Show with O.J. Not so much because of his fault, but Justinian I very nearly single-handedly revived the Roman Empire until wave after wave of natural disaster struck him. In the 6th century CE he managed to reconquer and expand the Roman Empire back to where it mostly was, created a unified set of laws for the fractured Eastern and Western Empire, and just needed to consolidate and allow populations to grow again. However, an awful outbreak of bubonic plague decimated tens of millions, and then in the east there was a huge earthquake and tsunami. Mainland Italy simply didn't have the numbers anymore to ever really be revived unless it restarted as a backwater comparable to the times of the Etruscans. If he had a stable population that was growing, it's entirely possible the Roman Empire could have risen again for who knows how long, preventing the Dark Ages occurring in Europe and retaining what we now see as lost technology. Al Bundy scored 4 touchdowns in a single high school football match. Then he met and married that red-headed, high-heeled, spandex monster, and look what became of him. Biggest waste of potential if I've ever seen one. Looking just at the sphere of acting, Lindsay Lohan could have been a massive star today if she didn't completely ruin her life with drugs, alcohol, and drama. I mean, she's still young. Look at Robert Downey Jr. to see that it can work out. Of course, he is a man and the rules are different for female actors who start getting cast as leads mom at about 30. How about Buddy Holly? Managed to be an enormously influential popular musician during a career that lasted about 4 years beginning at the age of 18. He was one of the Beatles' biggest influences as well. Imagine what he could have done if he had existed in the 1960s. Wouldn't be the biggest, but I feel like Aaron Swartz could have contributed so much more to tech. The man was clearly brilliant and didn't deserve the punishment that ultimately led him to suicide. Pretty heartbreaking. Maybe not biggest in all of human history, but the first name that came to my mind is Bobby Fischer. After winning the World Chess Championship, he essentially went insane. A computer analysis of many of the most famous players' games put Fischer as the most accurate player of all time, even above Kasparov. Granted, this was in 2008, when computers were considerably weaker than they are now, and before the rise of Magnus Carlsen, but the point still stands. And this was with him disappearing off the scene at the age of 29. Imagine what he could have done if he had never stopped playing. Catherine the Great's son. He was smart and desired to learn how to rule and command so he could be as influential as Catherine. She was so afraid of a coup that she refused to let him learn, so he turned into a lazy good-for-nothing. I don't know, but on the flip side I have to admire how Drake has made it big time in spite of having no natural talent. I have this book called The Biographical Dictionary of Literary Failure, which talks about people who could have been as big in classical literature as Dickens, Dante, Kafka, or even Shakespeare, but for one reason or another their work was lost to history, or never written at all. Some examples. Casimir Adamowicz Kostrowski, who, like Kafka, Dickinson, and Virgil, asked his friends to burn his work in the event of his death. Unlike the authors we heard of, the friend actually did it. Jürgen Kittler, whose works in the 1970s were, possibly, so devastatingly revolutionary that they were never published. Copies of these works, possibly, exist, but they are, possibly, under government embargo, not to be released for 100 years. Although Orchid, whose entire body of work exists only in the deceased language of Cimbrian. Chad Sheehan, who came up with amazing first lines and never tried to write beyond them. Edward Nash, who spent his entire life trying to craft the perfect sentence. Herman von Abwartz, who was beaten to death and buried in a shallow grave with the only copy of his poetry. While it's unlikely that any of these qualify as the biggest waste of potential in human history, I think they're all really fascinating cases, and shed a lot of light on how someone we think is incredible now might be completely forgotten in a few hundred years, or how easy it is to squander our own potential. A couple things have been pointed out to me. 1. Cimbrian is still spoken by 2,000 people. 2. This book is apparently a work of fiction according to Goodreads. My copy is sadly unmarked in this regard, which I suppose just goes to show that you Jeff was right all along, and whoever the person with the most wasted potential is, we will never have any idea who they are. Dude, the Biographical Dictionary of Literary Failure is fiction. Fiction. None of the peeps mentioned ever existed. Jerry Springer, the guy was on the verge of becoming a leader in the Democratic Party. Then he sees a prostitute, and gets caught since he wrote her a check. Then, he staged a comeback and became mayor of Cincinnati, but then he lost a bid for governor, gave up politics, and is now famous for hosting a trashy television talk show. Just a nitpick. When you say mayor, I think most people imagine a strong executive position that's directly elected and has a 4-year term or so. This wasn't that. Cincinnati had a council-manager style of city government back then. He was elected to the city council, and then the city council chose a mayor from among themselves to serve for a year at a time. Now, to be fair, it's still an accomplishment, but he served 1 year in a rotating position of relatively limited authority that he wasn't directly elected to. Henry Moseley was an extremely gifted English physicist who died in the Battle of Gallipoli during World War I. He had made numerous contributions to the field of physics before volunteering for the Royal Engineers in the British Army. He was only 27 when he was shot and killed in combat. Moseley is an example of a man with great intellect and insight who was taken from the world too soon. I deeply respect his decision to volunteer and serve his country, but one can only imagine the contributions he would have made to the world had he survived. Exactly this. Britain losing Moseley was so bad that after World War I the government forbid any major scientists from enlisting in the armed forces. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.